Today's reading is taken from Isaiah 40, verses 27 to 31. O Jacob, how can you say the Lord does not see your troubles? O Israel, how can you say God ignores your rights? Have you never heard? Have you never understood? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. No one can measure the depths of his understanding. He gives power to the weak and strength to the powerless. Even youths will become weak and tired, and young men will fall in exhaustion. But those who trust in the Lord will find new strength. They will soar high on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will not walk and not faint. Thanks be to God.
So we pick up this book of Isaiah in the 40th chapter, the 40th of 66. The 40th chapter that begins on a somber, gloomy note. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Why did they need to be comforted? The answer is found in chapter 39, the previous chapter, that outlines Isaiah's prophecy of Babylon's utter defeat of the Jewish nation. Chapter 39, verses 5 to 7 says, Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, Hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Bubba, could we have that map up, please? Babylon's conquest of Judah, 600 years before the birth of Christ, resulted in the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, including the great temple built by Solomon. The richest and most educated were carried away to Babylon, while the poorest and the most vulnerable were left to fend for themselves in whatever was left in the battle-scarred land. The Babylonian exile lasted between 48 and 59 years, depending on the sources you're reading, and the start date of the captivity. The captivity began in either 586 BC or 597, when Nebuchadnezzar II, crown prince of Babylon, defeated the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, exiled leading citizens of Judah to Babylon. But he only deported the most prominent citizens, such as professionals, priests, and craftsmen. And it ended in 538 BC, when the Persian king Cyrus allowed the Jewish people to return. A former US president speaking at the University of Michigan said, "In our time, we have the opportunity to move not only to the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society." I wonder how the Jewish captives in Babylon would have responded to those words. A rich society? They were refugees, and their homes and their home city, holy city, were in ruins. A powerful society? They had no leader, no army, and they were weak and helpless before their neighbours. And a great society? They had been guilty of great rebellion against God and suffered humiliation as a consequence and were crushed. The captivity is an important part of Israel's history and is considered to demonstrate God's faithfulness to his people, his judgment of sin, and the certainty of his promises. Babylon proved to be a better school for the Jewish people than the centuries of teaching by scribes. Once and for all, they set aside their worship of false gods, never to take it up again. During this time, synagogues were formed for the study and preservation of God's world. This time, after testing, the people came out stronger. The message of Isaiah 40 and the words that Rebecca read to us this morning was meant to encourage them during their coming captivity, during their time of waiting. Isaiah reminded them that this was a time of waiting on the Lord. This was not the idling away of time that marks the summer breaks for school children. It was a time of active anticipation, of looking for what will happen next. It has been defined as strong enough to hold out, solid endurance, as stiff as a piece of oak that never bends under pressure. And we all have times in our lives when we feel abandoned, when we feel forsaken. It seems that whenever we turn on the news or open our newspapers, there is little to encourage us. So I'd like to share this short piece of practical theology with you. Look around and you may be distressed. Look at yourself, you may be depressed. But look to God and you'll be blessed. When the outlook is bleak, we need the uplook. This is why earlier in the chapter, Isaiah told them to stop looking inwardly at themselves and to look by faith at the God who loved them and promised to do great things for them. In verse 9 of the chapter, he writes, "Do not be afraid. Here is your God." In this book, God on Mute, Pete Gregg tells the story that I would like to just share part of with you. I drove home from a board meeting with my good buddy Mike, a guy who looked so much like Buzz Lightyear that he could, and in my opinion should, make a fortune at children's parties. More importantly, Mike is also the nicest person to exist since Jesus. In spite of his niceness, Mike and his wife Jo have not had an easy ride over the past few years. Their daughter Lucy was born with profound physical disability, which means that she will almost certainly never walk. In her first 3 years, her little body endured 4 major operations. Mike and Jo were only beginning to come to terms with the emotional and practical challenges of this situation when the leaders of their church had a disagreement that gradually led to their community falling apart. Understandably, Mike and Jo felt sad and angry, unsure even who to blame. And around this time, Mike's hips began aching, and at the age of just 32, he was diagnosed with degenerative arthritis. To make matters worse, he's an outdoor pursuits instructor whose job involves hiking, cycling, climbing, canoeing, and sailing. What would this diagnosis mean for his career and their future? On top of all these difficulties, I knew that Mike and Jo were desperate to relocate and had been praying like crazy without success for their house to sell. "How on earth do you cope with it all?" I asked Mike as we drove slalom through the rain down the narrow winding lanes of Dorset. "With what?" he asked. "You know, the church, the house, Lucy's condition, the arthritis." "Oh, that," he laughed. "I'm not sure that I do cope." "Yeah, but how do you make sense of it all, Mike? Where does it all leave you and God?" He went quiet. The wipers swept rain from the windscreen, and then Mike, looking more like Buzz Lightyear than ever before, cleared his throat and said something very simple and very profound. "I guess I've realised that life is fundamentally tough." He glanced at me and grinned. "God's good and faithful, but life really can be can't it?" I chuckled and Mike drove on in silence. "I guess," he continued eventually, speaking slowly as if he were laboriously pulling thoughts from a swamp, "I guess I used to think that I had some kind of divine right to happiness. I mean, obviously, I knew there was going to be the occasional rough patch, but, well, to be honest with you, these days I find it easier to accept that life's tough, like they did hundreds of years ago before penicillin and flushing toilets. than to feel sort of hard done by, as if I've been robbed. Why blame God for stuff that's just the reality of life on a messed up planet? Am I making sense? God is always faithful. And Isaiah told the people of Israel to wait patiently for him. I'd like to share another story with you, a personal one. A guy I know had what looked like a perfect upbringing, perfect childhood, and affluent. But from the time that he was 12 to the time that he was 14, he was abused by his father. He then married, and soon after the birth of his second child, his wife was diagnosed with a terminal lung-heart condition, for which the only cure was a double transplant. Through much prayer and waiting, a transplant became available, and she received that transplant. But not long afterwards, she picked up an infection and died, leaving him with an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. Life was tough, as you can imagine. And in his desperation, he turned to drinking a bit too much. That led to occasional use of taking drugs. And then looking at things on the internet that we should not be looking at. And he spiraled deeper and deeper and deeper into these depths, which has led to a prison sentence. Through that time, God was always there. Through his schooling, through his mother, God was always at the side. Before his custodial sentence, he started attending a church and really started to build that relationship and trust with God. And in prison, God has used him to huge effect to support, encourage, and help prisoners who are in a similar situation to him. So waiting on the Lord is never wasted time. It's when we cultivate our faith through reading and study of God's word. When we learn the lessons of how we ought to pray, when we employ our gifts and efforts in the service of God and others. Why is waiting even necessary? Because God's timing is not our timing. God's timing is perfect. It's the correct timing. When I was teaching, I ran an after-school gardening club. Watching the wonder on young children's faces as plants grow and eventually bear fruit is fantastic. And sometimes the younger children are impatient. They expect to see instant results in the seeds that they have just planted, or they water and water and water until the seeds just rot and decay. But plants grow on their own timeline. Our wanting something so badly we cannot wait has no bearing on God's decision on when and how he will move. There is no better time to learn about God's sovereignty than when we are waiting on him. Over our interests are the interests of the kingdom, and God's desire to conform us to his own image. Waiting is part of that. And when finally that waiting is over, God promises renewed strength. To illustrate this, Isaiah gives us the picture of an eagle, an athlete, and a walker. In chapter 40, the word faint or a related term is used 5 times. He knows that the reader may feel exhausted, as we do, under the burden of Babylonian exile, and during this prolonged period of waiting. But the promise is given that they will renew their strength. Can you have that next picture, please, Bubba? By soaring up with wings as eagles. The term soar means literally to rise up to another level. As the eagle is able to soar to spectacular heights on wing currents, God's children will gain new heights by being uplifted by the Spirit of God. That same idea is carried through with the promise that we shall run and not be weary. Running speaks to us of urgency and reminds us of the messengers that were sent to convey important messages. These runners told of the outcomes of battles, the death of kings, the birth of princes, issued calls to arms on behalf of their sovereigns. There is an urgency to our task of witnessing to a lost world that requires our best effort and the energizing power of the Spirit. Running also speaks of enthusiasm, the excitement of a new initiative. We want to hurry and get to it, to experience the new adventure and enjoy the thrill of something new. One of the joys of the Christian life is that even though someone has been on the way for a very long time, there remains newness and freshness that makes each day one of promise. And finally, Isaiah says that these renewed people will walk and not grow faint. Walking speaks of the everyday. Although running and flying are important, we spend far more time and effort and cover more distance by walking than anything else. Life can't always be lived on an adrenaline high, and so we need strength to face the challenges. Large or small, the routine hurdles, the uphill trudges that come with settled living. As someone has said, we're often more bothered by the pebble in our shoe than the mountain we climb. The everyday is the real testing ground for our faith. If we can live successfully for the Lord in these common moments, we are more ready to take on the massive challenges that we may face another time. Whether in a place like Babylon, in a hospital room, in a job that doesn't fulfill us, or maybe we feel that we are at a dead end, if we are waiting on the Lord in expectation, not neglecting present opportunities, we can expect that he will renew our strength as the eagles. We can still soar. We can run when we need to, and we will continue to walk. God is with you. I'd like to share with you some of the words of St. Patrick. So can we have those words up, please, Bubba? That's it. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eye to look before me, God's ear to hear me, God's work to speak for me, God's hand to guard me, God's shield to protect me, God's host to save me. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in the eye, every eye that sees me, and Christ in every ear